electoral reform. So it does a bunch of things, but I think the most important thing for people to know is this is the biggest reform package when it comes to election law reform and political reform that we've seen in decades in America. You might think that's great, you might think it's terrible, but this would really overhaul our election systems. Let's talk about the main things that it does. It attacks the issue of money in politics, campaign finance. So it has some programs, for instance, that would create public financing to help people run for federal office. You raise a little bit of private money, you get even more public money. It would do things like tighten up ethics laws. It would prevent members of Congress, for instance, from sitting on corporate boards. It has certain restrictions when it comes to lobbyists. It would even create an ethics code for the Supreme Court, something right now that they don't have a mandatory code. And then there's a whole other bucket of things like voting rights. And it would provide some election security measures. It would create automatic voter registration, it would allow mail-in ballots to be sent to registered voters. It would also create independent redistricting commissions. So if you live in a state now where your lawmakers draw district lines, instead an independent redistricting commission would do that. So there's a lot in here. It's been kind of sold as voting rights and anti-corruption. There's a lot of little pieces throughout HR 1. And of course, it's called HR 1 because this is the Democrats' top priority when it comes to what they want to pass right now.
Yeah, and I mean, it was passed through the House Wednesday night. So what is next for this bill? Is it feasible that it will get through the Senate?
Feasible, but not likely. And I think everybody knows this. So HR 1 passed through the House on almost a party line vote. I think that there was one Democrat who voted against it. He said, look, my constituents don't want an independent redistricting commission. I'm responding to my constituents. But otherwise, this really was a party line vote. What happens next? It goes to the Senate and people might think, oh, okay, well, Democrats support this. Democrats have 50 members in the Senate and Vice President Kamala Harris is the tie-breaking vote. Well, of course, as we now see, so many things actually need 60 votes in the Senate because of the filibuster. Otherwise, the minority party can block it. And I think that's frankly how HR 1 is going to die, because there just aren't 60 votes in the Senate. If the House is any indication, this is another party line vote, you're going to have, at best, a split vote. And I think the Democrats might lose a couple of members.
And, you know, we're seeing that right now with the stimulus package. The same thing happened. Vice President Kamala Harris had to come in and break that tie. So I'm curious, is there any ways to get around that right now? Obviously, the 60 coming through on that. But this is a high priority for the Democrats, and it has been. We'll talk about the history in just a second here. But are there any ways to kind of circumvent that?
I don't think with the filibuster. So for Democrats, what's the path forward? This is really the moments where Democrats have to say, are we going to eliminate the filibuster? Yeah. I don't know that they have the political support to eliminate the filibuster. But when you see Democrats running on the idea of needing election reform, passing that election reform in the House, and then the American public looking and saying, you have the Senate, you have the White House, what's happening? This is the moment where Democrats are really going to have to say, do we want to just eliminate the Senate procedure or do we not? Because as we've seen with the stimulus, as you pointed out, there are some things, particularly when it comes to budgetary matters, where you only need 50 votes. But for a lot of business before the Senate, you need that 60. And that's going to make a huge difference for our country, particularly right now, as we're going into the midterms, when after the midterms, we might have a split government, split control.
And let's talk about the history of HR 1. This isn't the first time that it has been presented, correct?
Right. Democrats actually in the House passed this, I believe, 2 years ago. So this was presented, I think, in 2019. And this has kind of a wish list that Democrats have wanted for a long time when it comes to voting rights, anti-corruption, ethics, money in politics. There's a whole host of things here that have a lot of support among the Democratic caucus. And you're right, if it feels like deja vu all over again, It is. This is the second passage of this particular bill.
Yeah. Have any parts of it changed because we had such a crazy election year this year? You know, firsthand, we spoke several times during this. You know, it was in the middle of a pandemic, and it really brought out some of the faults in American voting, right?
Yeah, I don't think that there have been major overhauls. You know, voting in America tends to be, particularly in terms of election administration issues or kind of how you get your ballot or how you register, it tends to be something that some of us pay attention to right around the end of October, beginning of November.
Yeah.
And then we really don't think about it very much again. So I think you're exactly right. It did show some fault lines. How much do we care about trying to patch up those fault lines in the middle of a pandemic when we may be facing a serious economic recovery that we have to tackle? I don't know that there's enough political will, and this is always the issue when it comes to political reform, election reform. Can you keep the momentum going after the election? Can you keep it going when it looks like there's not another big election on the horizon again for at least 2 years?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that because there's been at least 33 states that have already introduced, pre-filed, or carried over 165 restrictive bills to re-tighten some of those voting requirements, including in Georgia, Arizona, we're seeing legislation being presented. So this is an ongoing conversation. How is that legislation different than this HR 1?
Yeah, so what's happening with HR 1, as you said, it's being proposed, it's being discussed, it's going to the Senate against the backdrop of a situation where we have, the last count I saw was over 205 voting proposals that would create more restrictive voting laws. For instance, more stringent voter ID requirements, reducing the ability to send vote by mail ballots, maybe reducing early voting. And so what we see really in the states is we see this kind of battle between the more red states that are saying we're worried about voter fraud and we need to quote unquote tighten up these voter restrictions. And then we see blue states saying, I don't see evidence of voter fraud. We were much more worried about voter suppression. And so you see states like, I'm talking to you from California, where we talk about things like universal automatic registration. We talk about things like sending a ballot to everybody. So the federal law, to the extent HR 1 became law, and to the extent that it conflicts with state law, it would preempt. You know, again, under the supremacy clause, the federal law in a lot of ways could create a floor of protection. But we need to remember a couple of things. One, under the Constitution, states determine the time, place, and manner of elections. Two, we have to keep in mind that the federal law really can affect federal races. And state laws similarly can affect both how you elect statewide officials and local state officials, but then also really how states conduct elections. I mean, as you know, the way you vote in, for instance, Arizona, you can have a completely different experience than I would.
Right. Yeah. And again, we saw all of that in this last election year, every state being a little bit different. And now we're seeing the repercussions of that. Pennsylvania is in several hearings talking about their election law in general, how they're going to change things moving forward. But it's interesting that this will affect national elections. I hear that. For people who are sitting at home right now, normal voters like you and me, what is the biggest way that this would affect their voting experience if it does so happen to pass through?
I'm going to give you a totally unsatisfactory answer. If HR 1 becomes law, how would it affect your right to vote? How would it affect your voting experience? The answer is actually what we were just talking about, which is it depends on what your current voting experience is. Yeah. And I know that's going to sound to everybody like, I don't want to answer the question, but it might totally change your voting experience. You might have really stringent requirements when it comes to voter registration. You might have very limited abilities to vote by mail. You might live in a state where state officials are the ones who draw district lines, in which case HR 1 would implement pretty significant changes, at least when it comes to the federal elections. Or you might live in a state where you frankly already have some of the provisions that we see in HR 1. Maybe on the state level, you already have some public financing. You're used to that. Maybe you have stringent ethics laws on the statewide level. Maybe it's very easy to register to vote. You automatically get a vote by mail ballot. So depending on what your current status quo is, HR 1, if it becomes law, will create a really big change, or it will feel like more of the same.
So what are you going to be watching?
I'm going to be watching a couple of things. One, will states try and take up the mantle? Will kind of purple bluish states say, if HR 1 fails, let's try and do what we can. We support the ideas behind what's in HR 1, and will states, the so-called laboratories of democracy, say, let's try and implement a lot of what the law was trying to do. The other thing I'm looking for is how much will Democrats say, okay, we were sent here to govern, and this is the moment where we say goodbye to the filibuster. I don't think Democrats are going to do that, but then you do need to go back and explain to your constituents why you ran on election reform, you ran on political reform, and here's why that was thwarted. The filibuster is like the third rail. Nobody really wants to touch it. So I'm going to be looking to see what do other states do in response, and what do Democrats in the Senate do with respect to the filibuster.
Yep. We're definitely going to be watching all of that with HR 1 and with this stimulus package. Jessica, thank you so much